Sir, may I now take you over to your other love, aviation. You have given credit in an interview to a friend of mine, to Mr. Vincent.
Vincent, Neville Vincent.
Neville Vincent, for the birth and establishment of civil aviation in India. Can you recount how it all started?
Yes, very easily. Neville Vincent was a retired British Air Force officer and pilot who, with another friend called Newell, Captain Newell, they brought in two World War One biplanes bought from the Air Force surplus, and they came to India. And in those days, in many parts of the world, aviation started by pilots with World War One planes, later on more modern planes, would give air rides to people. They would find a field somewhere near a town, then they'd announce that it would cost, say, 25 rupees or 50 rupees a ride, and they'd give air rides. And so Mr. Vincent and his friend Newell Captain Vincent went round this country for about 2 years giving joy rides. He was a very intelligent man, and he realized that sooner or later commercial aviation must come here. And he knew that the British airline, which was Imperial Airways, was preparing to extend its operations, which were then only up to the Mediterranean and to Eastern Europe, across the Mediterranean to Egypt, from Egypt to Karachi, and on the way to ultimately to Australia. And so he had this idea that the mails, which up to now used to come by boat every week, by the P&O boats, that the mails would then be brought from England by Imperial Airways, and those that didn't want to go on east but that needed to come down to Bombay and South India would be carried by train. And that this was an opportunity to have a mail operation, to pick up the mails at Karachi and fly them down on the way to Ahmedabad, to Bombay, and to Madras. So that was his scheme, which he worked out. And then he went to another Parsi firm, the Mehtas, Sir Homi Mehta and his sons, and interested them. He never came to us at first, but soon found out that they were not the kind of people. I had started flying, I'd become known. He thought that Tatas would be too big to ask them to undertake a small airline with a couple of aeroplanes. But he came to me, and I immediately took to him. He was a great big, very strong man who had distinguished himself in the Air Force. And I'll tell you one story about him that showed what a brave and also physically powerful man he was. I took to him at once. It seemed a very simple, reasonable proposition and cheap to start with. All you need are two small aeroplanes to carry a couple of bags of mail, maybe at the beginning. And I took this to my chairman, Sir J R D Tata, who didn't think it was at all intelligent idea, and he didn't turn it down outright, but he wasn't interested. So I went to my guru, Mr. Peterson, about whom I've talked. And Peterson went to the chairman, to Sir Dorab, and said, look, let the young man do it. It's good for him and it's good for the firm, and it's a thing that will be good for India, which is what I tried to tell her. So, and it would have cost very little. After all, each aeroplane, second-hand Pussmoth, each cost about 1,200 pounds. So, and all we needed was 3 pilots, including myself.
How could they allow you, who might have been probably a successor, to run such a heavy risk?
In what was I? I was 26, 27. And they said he's crazy, but never mind, let's let him try. Didn't think there was much in it somehow. Anyway, the next thing was to try and get the government of India to agree to give us a mail contract. And we wanted at least that they should pay a little subsidy maybe I think we expected perhaps ₹1,00,000 a year. But that was not forthcoming. They were prepared to give us the contract provided we didn't ask for any subsidy and that we'd be satisfied only with the extra surcharge on the letters to fly on, to be flown. And in the end, we agreed, naturally. And that's how it started. And Neville Vincent was the manager. And he stayed until the war came along.
You mentioned somewhere about his physical strength.
Oh, yes, I'll tell you. He was decorated, amongst other things, for his performance on an occasion when in the Libyan desert, in those days, Libya and all that part was under the British. The Lebanon, Libya, Iraq, all the whole of that area was under British control. But there were rebels and there was trouble from time to time. And the Bedouins, or whatever they were called, the Arab chiefs, on which the kind of people who ultimately conquered Saudi Arabia. King Saud, who was not king in those days, who conquered his kingdom with his own sword. So on one occasion, they had to force land it at night. He and this aeroplane had guns facing forward, and then there was a gunner at the back with a gun facing backwards. And so on an evening, they force landed in the desert. And then as night came, they were surrounded by rebels who thought it would be a good prize to kill the pilots and capture this aeroplane, or maybe cut it up and sell parts of it. Anyway, what the brave deed that performed by Mr. Captain Vincent was that he put his gunner in the cockpit in front. And then in order to face and be able to move around, he went back and he lifted the tail of the plane on his shoulder. Now, that was a big plane and quite heavy, and could only be done by a very heavy man. And so, with the gunner in front, sitting in the cockpit and firing guns, the guns were fixed forward. Vincent at the back had to move in order to face forward. A very, very brave and a task that needed great physical strength and courage. So anyway, then the war came along. When the war came along, government took Tata Airlines, had grown by then. We were operating to Delhi and to other places. But aviation, commercial aviation, was more or less taken over by the government. And then we decided we'd like to play a part in the war effort, and I wanted to make aeroplanes. And we, Mr. Captain Vincent, who was then the general manager of Tata's, we formed a company called Tata Aircraft, and we got the government of England. We wanted to make an aircraft that could be built in India quickly. And there was one remarkable small bomber aircraft, in the legendary one in England, made by de Havilland, who were also the creators of the Portsmouth and on, called the Mosquito. It had two engines, was made totally of wood, and it had very high speed and a long range. And in fact, they used to put one bomb on it, and they used it even to bomb Berlin. So the British government and the Air Force and the Indian government agreed. So we built a factory in Pune. When I sent Vincent to do everything for that. He'd fly to England. And from time to time, he'd use his old Air Force relationship to fly on Air Force planes. And in 1942, to come back to India to proceed with the building of this factory, he was shot down over the Atlantic and disappeared.
You are very fond of him, weren't you?
I was very fond
highly of him.
Very
all the
fond.
time.
But an important thing that followed on that I think is worth recording in this series, that then, strangely enough, the British government combined with the Indian government, or the military authorities of England, Britain, and the British India, which was also the British, they suddenly said they didn't want to make the Mosquito in India. Probably they didn't want to create a new aircraft industry. But they said, make gliders. Gliders for what? Invasion gliders. You know that much of the invasion of the coast of France in 1944 were in the form of gliders containing, each would contain 12 or 16 men, and they were towed out by bombers and then released over France at night and gliding in and crashing in. That was the way to do it. So we said, we'll do anything if it's good for the war effort. But then afterwards we said, but where are the aeroplanes to tow the gliders? And then I asked, and they didn't have the answer. And then I said, where are you going to use the gliders? From here? Are you going to tow them back to Europe? Or is it for the Arakan? They didn't know. And I think the whole thing was the most idiotic scheme. So the whole project that I was dreaming of becoming an aircraft manufacturer died out. And all we used, the organization that we had was to help in liquidating the American Air Force surplus. And I may say incidentally that when Captain Vincent died, I borrowed the Director General of Civil Aviation, here a very fine man who stayed with us for some years. He was called Sir Frederick Timms. Yes. I used to know him as Freddie, and for the moment the name escaped me. And Frederick Timms stayed with us and took the place of Captain Vincent as head of Air India, and then also helped liquidating that company for, Tata Aircraft still exists as a paper company, but there's nothing in it.
It still exists as a paper company.
In case it can be used.
Just 1 second to take you back to your flight from Karachi to London and your generosity to SP engineer. Did that lead to you losing the Aga Khan Prize by 2 hours? You gave him some spark plug or whatever.
Yes. But
did you were you aware that this would happen?
No, I was still hoping to win. He had an advantage. He was a little closer. But it's something that I think anybody would have done. That's what sport is for. If you don't have sportsmanship, what is the point? It was not a business thing. It was not a war. It was a competition. And SP engineer was very young. I was by then in 1930. I was 26. SP engineer was just 19 or so. A young Parsi from a relatively poor Parsi family in Karachi, which incidentally produced, all his men went into the Air Force. There were 3 or 4 and who reached a high rank. So when I landed I would not normally, it's luck also, I would not normally have landed at Alexandria. I went to Cairo because my compass, I had flown all the way from Bombay to Cairo with a compass that was 45 degrees out. I'd been let down by the engineer of the flying club who said, yes, he had checked the compass, but the compass was only 45 degrees out. So all the way towards, on the way to the Mediterranean from here, I used to drift to the right endlessly, including once I drifted 100 miles north of the Dead Sea. Found myself over the Sea of Galilee, which hadn't the right shape for the Dead Sea. Anyway, so I went to, it was unfortunately a Sunday, I flew to Cairo, and the Air Force, British Air Force was closed down. They said, go to Alexandria. Now there it happened that at Alexandria, I found another little moth, and I said, what's it doing here? And that was SP engineer. And so I asked him, I said, what are you doing here? He said, I'm waiting for plugs. I said, my dear fellow, don't tell me you left England without spare plugs. He said, yes, I did. But I've ordered them. So I wasn't going to let him wait. And to win, therefore, as he was the most advanced of those who had come in, there was another one who used to lose himself, so we can ignore him. So, whom I met at Gaza, by the way, on that same flight. So I gave him my plugs. I had spare plugs. You only needed 4 plugs per aeroplane. I had about 18 plugs or something, or 12 plugs. I gave him the plugs. So, and he in return gave me his Mae West. And he arrived at Karachi when I arrived in Paris.
Just a couple of hours.
But I tell you, I would have won. If it had not been that I'd made a bad mistake the previous day in landing in Naples instead of Rome, and I didn't realize that Naples aerodrome was entirely military. So I landed in the evening of the previous day, and I said I wanted to leave at 6 o'clock in the morning for London. I was going to do it direct. Oh, they said, you can't leave at 6 o'clock. Why not? Because the commandant of the airport only comes at 10. So I stuck there till 10 o'clock. And if I'd left at 6, and if everything had gone the way it did, I would have arrived in London before Aspie. No, I'm glad I didn't. First of all, the £500 prize that the Aga Khan gave was much more valuable to this young man than to me, even though it would have been quite welcome, I can tell you. It was half the cost of the aeroplane that I'd bought. But also on the strength of that, of this young man of 19 or 20 who had flown on his own from England to India, he was admitted into the Indian Air Force, which was just starting. He was admitted in the first fighter squadron of the Indian Air Force. And 20 years later, he became the commander-in-chief of the Air Force.
So, because you gave him 2 spare clothes.
No, 4. I was glad it helped him to set him up. And so I never regretted it. When we decided to buy these 2 aircraft, I told Vincent that I'd fly one out. I had done the trip in the other way, so I knew I could fly it back. And I had my wife with me. So I said, we'll make that we'll go slowly and comfortable.
You flew together?
We we were going to fly together from London to Bombay with this close mouth. No problem. If I'd done it in one mouth, at least this one had a cabin, the other one in the open. And so we started from London on the way to Bombay, and I wasn't feeling very well. But anyway, by the time I arrived in Rome, I had 104 fever. I was in a bad way. So I realized that it wouldn't be fair to fly her out sick, and we didn't want to spend maybe a week in Rome. Now, we used to travel every year to Europe by sea, my wife and I. And on the Italian line called Lloyd Triestino, it had a beautiful ship called the Victoria, which unfortunately during the war was torpedoed. So I knew that it came every week, and I inquired and found that it was leaving the next day for Bombay. So I phoned them up from Rome, and they said, come along. They started from Naples. So feeling a little better the next morning, my wife and I, we flew to Naples, and at Naples I'd arranged to call a taxi because the wings of the plane folded back. And you could lift up
Put the plane on the taxi.
No. All I did was if you fold back the wings, and then you lifted the tail, and you put the tail on the taxi, and tied it up.
A taxi trailing a plane down the road.
That's
Must
right.
have been quite a sight.
Right up to the port.
Do you have a picture of that by any chance?
Huh?
Do you have a picture of that?
No, unfortunately not. But it was a quite simple thing. Then Lloyd Triestino just put a cable around the front and the rear, picked it up, put it on the deck.
There you were.
And so it flew, instead of my flying it all the way as I'd hoped, we landed in Bombay with a plane on the deck.
In your message to Air India employees in July 31, 1953, you said a very lovely thing. You said death was to claim many of your colleagues, some unfortunately in accidents connected with our operations, and that each that went took with him a little of me. How many were killed? Who were they? Can you remember now?
When was this? In
1953? I think just before it was nationalized. In your last message to the Air India employees, you mentioned this. I was wondering how many were killed.
Not so many, but I think 3. 3 were killed, 1 on training. So 3 pilots.
But because Barucha and N.G. Gadgil.
Homi Barucha, Gadgil, and I forget who the third one was.
You mentioned that Captain Wyndham, the real founder of the Air Mail. I want you to take you back I think, sir, I'll have to take a little bit more of your time next time also because it's so fascinating. Partly the founders of, I suppose, Air Mail were Air France, weren't they? Who were the real pioneers in this?
No, I think that immediately after World War One, aeroplanes were in existence. And so everywhere in Europe and in America and even in South America, people got hold of planes and created mail lines. So the the short mail lines, say from London to Paris or across Europe, those were started. That kind of thing was started everywhere. Could have been started in India if we had aeroplanes and flying club and pilots, etc. But the dramatic ones were those who undertook with these World War One planes, quite inadequate for the purpose, who undertook a long-range operation, including the British, including the Dutch. You remember the KLM?
Yeah.
KLM came to India. But the most exciting and courageous and in some ways romantic and dramatic was a French airline which went from Toulouse, where the Airbus is made, from Toulouse, and the destination was what's the capital of Chile? Santiago de Chile. Now, when you look at the map, first of all, you've got to cross the South Atlantic. Well, they didn't have the aeroplanes, so they used to use, for some years, they used fast mail boats, which used to do the crossing in 2 days. So they used to fly down the west coast of Africa to Dakar. From Dakar, they used to send the mails across to the point of the northeast point of South America. Then down the coast, all the way down to the Argentine. That was not too bad. But then to cross, then that would have been enough going there. But they went to Chile. And the mountains of the Andes were higher, much higher than the ceiling that these poor World War One type of planes could fly. So they had to fly through the passes. Like in India, when we started, there was no radio aids, no radio even. They had their own little radio, no navigational aid. They had bad weather. They had to pass through passes. And so they had a harrowing, it was a real, what shall we call it, a heroic kind of operation.
If I am correct, sir, it all began as Tata Airlines. Then it became Air India. Then came Air India International. What is the story behind the transformation of Tata Airlines into Air India International?
Okay, it started such a small enterprise that Tata Airline, it was not even Tata Airlines, I think it was the Tata Airline, was all right for a little enterprise of this kind with half a dozen employees and just 2 planes. But when it grew, we felt that the name should become, as now it was established and its future existence and growth seemed to be assured, that it should have a name that was more suitable for an airline. Only one airline in the world had retained the name of the founder, that was Braniff Airlines in America, which ultimately went broke, incidentally, and was picked up by one of the other airlines. So we had to find a new name. Now, I had made up my mind, my own mind, that I wanted Air India, which I thought was suitable, with a hyphen in between, because I didn't want to sound as if somebody was giving the air to India. So I had decided to be very democratic, and to all employees we sent a questionnaire. And I gave, in order to be sure that Air India would be included, I gave a few suggestions. Indian Airlines, Air India, and a few others. But fortunately, there was almost unanimity in favor of Air India.
Without any prompting from you?
Without any, well, I sent all that I put the name Air India at the top of the list. That's all. So that was Air India. Then, when the time came for us after the war, we had been working even during the war in preparing a scheme in Air India for going abroad. And I'd hoped that Air India would, by the way, it was Air India Limited because it was a private company, private sector company, and you had to add the word limited. The shareholders of Air India Limited were some thousands of outside shareholders and Tata Sons.
There was this question of Neville Vincent being a partner, and there was a
Neville,
problem about.
yes. Oh, that was long before. That was his partner while it was Tata Airline in the early days. But that was settled. He was a 25% partner. But then don't forget that he got killed in the war. So after he died, there was no question of his having shares. He got all that was due to his family, plus something was taken care of. So the shareholders, it was the majority were shareholders, and Tata Sons had I forget what minority, a fairly large investment, but in those days it was still small. Now, when we decided that we wanted to go abroad and we prepared for it, and we went to the government said, no, we are going to do it ourselves. We are preparing a scheme for running an airline, a foreign airline. So that was a blow. And in order to get my way, what I thought would be a better way to do it, and also much cheaper, I pointed out that Air India Limited was well established, had a fund of experience by now. This was in 1947 that I'm talking, 46, 47. We had the engineers, we had the workshops, we had the experience, we had the pilots. And I said, look, if you do it yourself, by the time you buy aeroplane, you order aeroplanes, by the time you put up the workshops, you put up the hangars, you train the pilots, the engineers, the staff, it'll take you 3 years. If we do it, we are ready. I had in the meantime quietly booked 3 constellations, or at least optioned on 3 constellations, which were not picked up by TWA. This was by now in September 1947, when the partition took place and the country was in a terrible crisis. And I said, why don't we create a joint enterprise? This was the first joint enterprise between Government of India and the private sector, created by us, or by me then. I said, look, if you let us do it for you, we'll create a new company. You take 49% of that. We'll take a small percentage, and the public will take the rest. And we'll give you the option anytime you want to acquire 2% from Tata Sons so that you can become majority if you want to. And if you do that, we'll create this new company, we'll call it Air India International, and Air India Limited will act as its managers and suppliers, etc. And I said, if you do that, we're today in 47, we can start in June, in 6 months instead of 3 years. And to my astonishment, perhaps because they were so busy on this crisis, the political crisis, the massacres in the north, the refugees and all that, to my amazement, it took them about 10 days. I sent them a memorandum, 10 days to accept. So then that became Air India International. And so we launched that in 1948. And from the start, it went perfect.
Do you have any trouble with foreign exchange at that time?
Less evidently, because there was no problem. It's only 3 aeroplanes. They didn't cost what they cost now. I think these aeroplanes cost about 10 million. No, not even 10 million, probably $6-7 million. Today, it's $125 million. It went very well until 1953, when the government decided to nationalize the industry. So at that time, that is when they wanted to put everything together into one airline, government-owned. And that is when I dissuaded them from doing it, for the same reason that I'm now arguing against their merging the two. And I pointed out that if they did bring out one airline combining all the others consisted of about 10, which apart from Air India, one other airline was fairly well run. I said, if you do that, you realize, and if you you call it Air India, as you must, because otherwise you would have lost 5 years of the name Air India being used in the world and with high reputation. And when people came on, say, American Airlines or in Pan Am, and when they flew in India on one of these remnants of these airlines and saw what a horrible airline it was, with the name of Air India, they'd never fly Air India on international routes. They would think that that is Air India. So they agreed to keep it separate. And then, so Air India International became Air India. There was no need to call it international anymore because it was the only operation was international. And that is the story.
Did you at any time have any differences with the Rafi Ahmad Kirwai on the night postal services?
Yes.
What was the problem?
No, it is more than a problem. This is one of my, or probably that was my biggest mistake. When Rafi Ahmed Kidwai thought out, or somebody thought out for him, this scheme of a night air mail, which turned out very well. And he offered it to Air India, and I refused it because I said it wouldn't be safe. And the idea was the excellent one of planes from Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta, and Madras every night, overnight, flying into Nagpur in the center with their mails, and then according to where the mails were to go, flying out to the 4 points. And I pointed out that this would be a night operation. There was no ground facilities. There was no lighting, no proper navigation aids, and that it would be dangerous, and particularly during the monsoon, and it was premature. But I was wrong, because it turned out, maybe with this little luck, it turned out to work out very well. And it was an error on my part, as it was proved ultimately. Although it was inspired partly by the fact that in America, when there was a strike, I think, amongst some of the airlines, the government of America took over the whole of the mail service and gave it to the Air Force. And they had a number of accidents, inadequately trained, and inadequate pilots, inadequate ground services.
So about the same time?
A little earlier, but it happened. So anyway, so I didn't have particularly, can't say I had any quarrel with him. Not even when some years later, his doctor and my doctor were the same rather peculiar gentleman called Dr. Jal Patel, who was the president's doctor also. He had a naval rank. And he had one of his clinic in Bombay House, because he looked after the employees of Bombay House too. One evening he phoned me up and he said, you know whom I've got here? He said, I've got Rafi Ahmed Kidwai. I said, what's he doing there? He said, he's sick. And then I used that Churchill joke and said, nothing trivial, I trust. And so Dr. Patel naturally laughed and promptly repeated it to Rafi Ahmed Kidwai. I said, you damn fool, you realize, poor fellow, I didn't want him to hear it. But he survived.
When did you have the first inkling the companies you were chairman of would be nationalized? Did they give you any previous hint that this would be done? Was it a surprise to you? Why did you opt to be the chairman only of Air India International and not of the domestic airlines?
Because I pointed out, as I just told you, first of all, if I had to be chairman of both, and the other one was not merely the Indian Airlines, then became a putting together of 10 airlines, all of different kinds, integrating their staffs, closing down some routes. It would have been a very, very major task for quite a few, maybe 2 or 3 years. And I felt that it was Air India, which now abroad, which was the more important operation. It was one in which we had already established a reputation in the world, a good reputation, and I didn't want it to see it go down by bureaucratic management. So I said, no, I can't, I haven't spared the time to be the chairman of both. But if you separate the two, I will be glad to serve you as chairman for Air India only.
Has the service gone down now, or has it been in any way?
No, yes, of course. I'll tell you. nothing to boast about myself. But when I was thrown out of the board and the chairmanship, therefore,
How did it
by
happen?
Morarji in 1978.
Why did Morarji do that? What was
I'll
his...
tell you. In 1978, it was then, from that moment, it became run by, and he appointed Mr. Raguraj, a banker. From that moment, it became run by really like a typical public enterprise, interference from the top, everything going to Delhi, and the whole morale collapsed. What is the question you were asking? Why did Morarji?
Why did Morarji? What was his...
Morarji, I think I told you, there was a relationship with me from the beginning, outwardly friendly. I had the lowest opinion of him, both as a politician, as a man, or as an intellect. And I think maybe he sensed it. So we never had a very warm relationship, but we were friendly. But then during the Janta government, or rather before the Janta government, when Mrs. Gandhi, during the emergency, I remained, even after the emergency, I remained friendly with Mrs. Gandhi. But one thing that happened quite outside Air India or aviation, in those days, you know how Sanjay Gandhi used to behave. As an autocrat with powers that no constitution gave. The constitution never gave him, neither any official or parliament or anything, but he acted in many ways autocratically. So we were at that time wanting to build a hotel in Delhi, Tatas. And we have built a hotel, as you know. We built two now, but the first one was the Taj Mahal Hotel at Mansingh Road. And there used to be an old, rather smaller hotel on the site. Whatever the name was, even now I've forgotten the name, not Ferraro, some name like that. We bought it. And but we didn't start pulling down. We said we'll help them to continue until we're ready to build. We had to get all the permits and all that. So we sent about 10 men from the Taj to help organize the thing and prepare the training for when we demolish the hotel and build a new one. And then one day the police arrived, threw out our men and locked the doors. We didn't know what it was for. So then general manager, who is now vice chairman and managing director, Mr. Kerker, rushed to Delhi, found that the order had come from Mr. Sanjay Gandhi. So he quietly went to him. He said, I want to see Mr. Gandhi. And Sanjay received him. And Mr. Kerker said, why have you taken that? We are Tatars. We are coming to build a good hotel in Delhi. What have you done that? He said, we want to build a government hotel. I said, we'll do a much better job for you. So strangely, he thought he'd be thrown out in 15 minutes. And Sanjay kept him there for an hour. And Mr. Kerker showed him the plans. And then Sanjay got interested and began to make suggestions. And from then on, helped this thing to go through and was really helpful. So, though I totally disapproved of the political activities of Sanjay, still I felt that, and Mr. Kerker said you had at least to inform him that you appreciated his support, which I did. This seems to have gone later on, was known, I didn't make a secret of it, to Mr. Morarji Desai, who, when he got into power, thought it was a terrible thing for Mr. Tata to have thanked Sanjay Gandhi and to remain friendly with Mrs. Gandhi during the emergency. So he decided that the best way to do it was to get rid of me from Air India. So on the 30th of January 1978, I got a call from Air Chief Marshal Lal, who had been fired by Mrs. Gandhi as managing director of Indian Airlines, a very fine Air Force officer, the most intelligent of the military officers I'd come to know, and I'd met quite a few. I'd even employed one. But anyway, having been fired by Mrs. Gandhi a year previously, I gave him a job in Tata because I find he was a very capable fellow. And I employed him at Jamshedpur and Calcutta to become the chairman of the Indian Tube Company, which now is merged with Tata Steel. And he had barely time for studying the situation. He made a very good report, which showed his intelligence and grasp. When he phones me up on the 30th of January 1978 to tell me, Jay, I've just come from the Prime Minister. He's made me chairman of Air India.
Without even informing you?
Any at all. So I said, what did you say? He said, well, I told him, what about Mr. Tata? He said, oh, Mr. Tata has been there long enough. And he hasn't got a life, it's not a life post. He can go any time we say so. So I said, and then what did you do? He said, well, I've been a serving officer all my life. What can I do? I accepted. So, of course, my colleagues were all a bit outraged.
I mean, he didn't have the courtesy to tell you that he doesn't want your services, Morarji Desai?
No, not a word. I didn't hear a word from him until about 10 days later. I got a formal letter of appreciation of my services to Indian aviation. That's all. And then I remained out of the board. Even after the Janta government was defeated and Mrs. Gandhi came back to power. And I don't think she realized or she understood that maybe I should at least get on the board, not necessarily as chairman. By that time, I was already 74 years old or 75 years old. So it's only in 1982, 4 years later, I was still out of the board, out of anything, when I was preparing for this flight, commemorated flight, Puss Moth or Leopard Moth from Karachi to Bombay. I said I was 78 years old. And so it was a matter of public interest. I was interviewed, and one reporter told me that, do the directors approve of letting you... I said, what have they got to do? I'm not even on the board. He said, what, you're not on the board? This is ridiculous. So here is a man who's been chairman for 40 years, who's now going to risk his life, which it was not much of a risk his life for the good name of Air India, not on the board. So this eroded that, I forget in what paper. So the moment this came to the knowledge of Mrs. Gandhi, she immediately put me back on the board.
Did she call you up personally, or was it a letter?
Who, Mrs. Gandhi?
Mrs. Gandhi.
No, she just appointed, reformed the board or added me. And so I became a director again, but only a director until I was now out again for the final time when Mr. Tytler reformed the board, period.